Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to Cochrane Chapel this evening. I can tell that you all settled down right away as soon as we sat in the spot. Thank you for that. I am just thrilled that we have President Robert Zimmer of the University of Chicago here with us to talk about an issue that I think is so crucial both to schools of our sort and to universities, but also to our society at large at this point in our history. And as I think everybody knows, the University of Chicago has taken a very strong and very clear and very public stance on this topic under President Zimmer, although also historically. It'd be interesting to hear about how your stance relates to the previous stances. Most notably, University of Chicago has published the Chicago Principles, which many people refer to in the context of university statements on this topic. And President Zimmer has been very interested in engaging with young people, both at his university and more broadly, in an understanding of what we are seeking to do as schools and how that relates ultimately to this question of freedom of expression, academic freedom, and a variety of related topics. When we learned last year that he was eager to travel to some high schools, we jumped at the chance with the help from some fellow alumni and families and reached out to President Zimmer to learn if he would come to Andover. I'm delighted that we are the first place that he is coming as a high school to have this conversation, I imagine first of several, and we're delighted that you're here. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The format that we're going to follow tonight is going to be very simple. We will talk up here on the stage for about a half an hour. I've then invited 4 students who will be the first balls in with questions that they've thought about, and then we'll open the mics and we'll go till about 7:30 with your questions, and we look forward to a wonderful and robust conversation with all of you. So again, thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts, and hopefully this will be lively in the spirit of free expression that we have set forth here. President Zimmer, I wonder if you might just start with your thoughts on this topic broadly. I have a couple of things I'd love to ask you, but most of all, we're here to listen to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I think I'll try to be relatively brief. It's a subject about which I can talk for a very long time, but I will try to be concise and give you a general sense of sort of what the basis of the Chicago Principles were, why they're there, how at least I think about them, some of the history, and why they're so important. Let me just begin by being clear about the distinction between what I'm going to be talking about and some of the conversations that take place about the First Amendment. Because sometimes when people hear the phrase free expression, free speech, they think, oh, well, you're defending the First Amendment. That's not exactly right, because the First Amendment says in part, although I'm sitting here with a lawyer, so I shouldn't be quoting the law to him, but the First Amendment says in part that Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech. So it's talking about Congress, and that's been interpreted as talking about the government. So what the First Amendment is about is what the government can or cannot do. It doesn't say anything about what private schools, private universities can or cannot do. So I am not talking about the First Amendment. University of Chicago is a private institution, as is Phillips Andover. And there's another reason why I'm so focused on this issue, and that has to do with the very mission of universities and how it is that we do an excellent job, or under what circumstances will we actually do a less excellent job, maybe even a mediocre job. So what are we trying to do? So we really have 2 or 3 missions. So our 2 missions, of course, is 1, education. 2, we're a research institution, so our mission is also research. And the third is impact for the benefit of individuals and society as a whole, which flows out of our education and research work. We're going to focus on education because everybody here is interested in education. You're in school. Most students here, I assume, will go on to higher education experience. So let me focus a bit on the education A lot of what I'm going to say is also relevant to the research mission, but let's talk about the education. So when we talk about education at the University of Chicago, what are we talking about? What we're talking about is empowering individuals for their whole life. And what are we empowering them for? We're empowering them for really two things. One is their own personal development and personal growth, but we're also empowering them to do things. People who are going to graduate from the University of Chicago are going to go out and want to have an enormous impact in whatever field it is that they're involved in. And now what's going to be involved in having that impact? Whatever they're going to do, they are going to be faced with a large variety of immensely complex problems that take place in a certain context, an environment with a certain history, inside a certain culture. And how is it that you are going to learn how to be operating in that complex environment, confronting complex challenges, and having a significant impact on them? And this is not any one particular type of challenges. People who graduate from the university go on and do things across the full spectrum of human endeavor. So what is a kind of education that does that? It's way more than information transmission. Information transmission is really a small part of what an education like this involves. What it really involves is a set of intellectual skills, a set of habits of mind, of ways of thought that enable you to confront complexity. And what kinds of habits of mind are that? One needs to be able to analyze assumptions. You need to be able to look at things, and you need to be able to say, what are the assumptions underlying what's being said here, or what actions are being taken? What are my own assumptions in the way I look at things? You need to be able to actually recognize your own assumptions. You need to be able to look at a complex situation and realize that not all arguments point in the same direction. There actually are legitimate competing interests that need to be weighed against each other. You need to be able to hear very different perspectives because you're inevitably going to be dealing with people from wide variety of backgrounds, very different views, often very different legitimate views, and you have to be able to hear different sort of perspectives, be able to say, what are the arguments for them? What are the arguments against them? When do arguments apply? When do they not apply? You need to be able to integrate different things, and so on. So there's a whole set of habits of mind and intellectual skills that one needs to develop. And it is here that free expression and open discourse and intellectual challenge come into play, because the way to develop those skills is exactly to be in this environment of intellectual challenge. If you are not challenged, you are never going to be able to know what your assumptions are, recognize what your assumptions are, and be able to challenge your own assumptions. Being able to recognize and challenge your own assumptions and deal with the discomfort that comes with this is an extremely important skill in actually being able to accomplish things in a complex world. So it is on this basis that the university has historically taken the view that we are going to, with great determination, offer a systematically, intellectually challenging environment, that it's going to be one of constant open discourse and rigorous argument, and where in fact there's not going to be a lot of intellectual deference. So for example, I would say all the people who have won the Nobel Prize in economics at the University of Chicago, and there's a lot of them, often say in the economics department seminar room, there's no deference because you've won the Nobel Prize. You're a graduate student, you're an undergraduate, you're a junior faculty member. The environment is everybody's challenging each other, and that is the nature of the environment we've had. Now, historically, this has been very important for the university, and right from the very beginning of the university, you see statements by faculty, statements by the leaders of the university about this, and this has carried on through our whole history. We've had periods both in the 1950s in the McCarthy era and the 1930s where there was a huge amount of public concern about communists, members of the American Communist Party, speaking on university campuses. The University of Chicago took a very strong position, led by the president at the time, that people who were invited were not going to be uninvited. We don't uninvite anybody who faculty or students have asked to speak. So the origin of the document that became the Chicago Principles grew out of this history, which is beginning around 2013 or 14. What you saw was this cascade, this drumbeat of universities disinviting speakers. And why were they disinviting them? Because some segment of the university community thought that this person shouldn't be speak. They not only didn't want to hear that person speak, but they didn't want anybody else to hear them speak. And they were insisting that it was appropriate that because they didn't want to hear this person speak, that the university should uninvite them. Now, I knew that this was totally antithetical to the University of Chicago culture, but we did not actually have a clear statement written down. So I appointed a faculty committee specifically to articulate what the longstanding principles of the university had been about this. And what this included was that as part of this environment of constant intellectual challenge, faculty can invite who they want to come speak because they want to hear them, argue with them, agree with them, whatever they want to do with them. Recognized student groups can invite who they want for the same reason. And the university does not disinvite anybody. And in particular, just because some group of students or some group of faculty or some group of community members don't want to hear a particular person is no reason why other people shouldn't be able to hear them. So everybody has on our campus is encouraged, has the given right to be able to speak, invite, listen, argue, protest. But what you do not have the right to do, and what the university will not do, is disinvite somebody or shut somebody down or prevent them from speaking because you or they, whoever, doesn't want to hear them. And protest, for example, is an extremely valid and embraced form of expression, as long as it doesn't be disruptive to take away somebody else's right to speak and somebody's right to listen. I have protests against things I might say or do or positions I may take all the time, and that's totally fine as long as I, like everybody else, am not interrupted in what I have to say in a public forum, just as other people have the right to say what they want in a public forum. So that's been the basis of our position, and it is, I would say, reflected in the tone on campus. It is a place where people come because they seek out that environment of intellectual challenge, again, because they are going to be empowered to do things. So I hope you see from what I'm saying that this is not about the laws of the United States. It's not a theological principle. It's a principle about if you're a university and it's your job to actually give students the most empowering education, how do you do that? And it's certainly our judgment as to how you do that is to create this environment where they are going to develop the skills that they are going to need to be effective in a complex world.
Thank you. It's a wonderful opening, and maybe I'll take a couple questions if that's okay myself,
Yeah,
and
course.
then turn it over to some students. One thing is you mentioned the topic of disinvitation of speakers. It reminds me also of a letter that many of our students have read that the dean of the college sent out a few years ago, and I know every year there are versions of these letters. For those of us who are administrators at school, these are letters we dread writing because we wonder that no one will ever read them. One that was read extensively was one that took up some of these topics a few years ago by Dean Ellison. And one of the things I think many students have wondered about is this question of safe spaces on your campus. And I know some of the reactions to it were that the University of Chicago was hostile to the idea of safe spaces. I think there have been some subsequent statements about how that was interpreted. But I wonder if, just speaking to students who might be thinking about coming to the University of Chicago, was there a message being sent? And what in fact, is that, particularly to an undergraduate who might be 18 thinking about college?
Yeah, so one of the difficulties around phrases like safe spaces is that people are using the words in very different ways. If what you mean is that you go into your residence hall room and you sit and talk to two friends of yours and you feel comfortable and safe, nobody's against that. If what it means is that there's an environment in which intellectual challenge needs to be avoided, that you need to protect yourself against it, that there's something intrinsically threatening about intellectual challenge, and you need to be able to be made safe from challenge. That is actually antithetical to the nature of our environment. So if there's a criticism of the letter around safe spaces, it's a criticism of almost everybody's that I would make. It's the criticism I make about most discussions about safe spaces, which is the discussions would be helped a little bit if one were really precise about what it is one was talking about.
Seems important to do that, for sure. I think when I think about a safe space, I'm often thinking about a space like, for instance, a Hillel on a university campus, an environment in which Jewish students might decide to gather. I might think about an affinity group for students from a particular race or background. I might think about an LGBTQ environment in which students might talk about coming out on a high school campus. And to my mind, those are extremely important environments to be safe in a variety of ways, and that you might actually have a certain set of rules that govern the way in which we talk in that environment that might be quite different, in fact, than the rules that might govern other kinds of conversations. And I wonder if you think that's also antithetical to the point of a university.
Yeah, so I would say that, in fact, we don't do that in the following sense. We don't have exclusionary student groups. If you want to go to Hillel and you're, well, Hillel's a little complicated because it's not actually a university group, but suppose there's a Jewish students organization, let's say, and if you're a Muslim student or a Christian student or a Hindu student or somebody who has no identification with religion and you want to go, you can go. There's no, we don't say you have to pass the identity test to get into a university event or environment. Now, I mean, one needs to recognize that the nature of exclusion has a long and profound history on university campuses, like it does inside our society in general.
Or boarding schools, for that matter.
Or boarding schools. And the idea that we are going to reproduce that with some other collection of individuals with some other criteria for exclusion is not something that we're very interested in. So
maybe set aside, so fair enough, one might choose not to exclude. We actually might choose to do that in certain settings here, we could get into that. But might one imagine a different set of rules for the conversation, imagining, if Hillel's a bad example, then maybe move over to the LGBTQ environment. I know some of the pushback on that letter was to do with that environment at Chicago. If you have students who are coming out or seek to be coming out, might you imagine a space in which there were rules around the conversation that said particular hate speech directed at students who are homosexual or might be transgender students or so forth, and would disallow in that space that kind of expression?
My own view is that the more you start creating these things, it just becomes a kind of endless cascade. So on one hand, there's no statement you can make that one says this holds under every possible circumstance. I mean, that's just a kind of naive thing to say. So I would never claim to be making any statement about anything that I would say under absolutely every circumstance this must hold. I mean, that's just silly. On the other hand, the more one starts imagining these things and the more one starts equating the environment of discourse for an education with a kind of allowable way of saying, well, this is not, we're not going to allow this, we're not going to allow that, we're not going to allow this, and now you have this whole elaborate scheme of things that are not allowed. It creates a very different sort of environment, and the nature of the environment is what's critical. Now, let me just say two more things about this. So one thing you're touching on here is issues around diversity, inclusion, the nature.
That was my next question, so you can answer with that.
Well, the nature of the environment for that. So we have, as I said before, I mean, you have in this society, like every society, but this society in particular, it's the one we're living in, has a deep history of exclusionary behavior. The legacy of that is very much with us all the time. And to either try to avoid that or deny that is deeply problematic as far as I'm concerned. And universities are communities, and there are absolutely need to be ways in which you deal with people who have a need for support around certain kinds of issues connected to either identity issues or something that somebody said and so on. And all that's fine, all that's welcome, and all that's necessary. That's very different from setting up in an a priori way a set of things you can't talk about, a set of things you can't say, a set of places you can't say anything. It's just a very different thing. So the idea that you create this environment that is dynamic, that's rigorous, that's challenging for everybody, and it should be pointed out that environment of free expression is challenging for absolutely everybody, that the idea that you create that, but you recognize at the same time that there are things that one needs to do to provide supports for people in various ways. And of course you want to do that. But you don't want to do it by undermining your own principles and undermining the quality of your education that you're actually trying to give to people. And that's what the distinction is in my mind about creating this environment. We don't do this, we don't do this. By the way, if you're over there, you can't say this. It's just a bad tone if you really want intellectual challenge and you want to empower people. So that's sort of the way I would look at it.